Tearing Down the Walls, Queerness, Anarchism, and the Prison Industrial Complex by Jason Lydon, from the book Queering Anarchism by C.B. Daring, J. Rogue, Deric Shannon, and Abbey Volcano. This text from theanarchistlibrary.org. Quote, with anarchy, the society as a whole not only maintains itself at an equal expense to all, but progresses in a creative process unhindered by any class, caste, or party. End quote, by Kwesi Balagoon. Kwesi Balagoon was a revolutionary New African anarchist, closeted queer, freedom fighter, who died in prison of AIDS-related illness on December 13, 1986, when I was nearly 4 years old. His story and struggle is an essential reminder to queer communities that if we do not step up the fight against white supremacy, capitalism, heteropatriarchy, and the prison industrial complex, then stories of our revolutionary ancestors will go untold, and our capacity to create an intersectional movement for today will be minimal. This essay works to bring together the interlocking aspects of the movements for queer liberation, abolition of the prison industrial complex, and anarchism. It is vital to have a common understanding of language to most effectively have a conversation that is movement building. The prison industrial complex is a multifaceted construction of control and domination, most commonly seen as the U.S. prison and jail system, the concrete and steel buildings that warehouse individuals. While prisons and jails are a pivotal aspect, the prison industrial complex includes an entire culture of state and corporate collusion to control, discipline, and torture poor and low-income communities and communities of color. The tactics range from police forces to cameras mounted in communities, from the injustice system to corporate profiteering off prison phone calls, from immigration enforcement to media depictions of criminals, and so on. The prison industrial complex builds its strength from the myth that it is solving the problems of crime and violence. Marilyn Buck, a white anti-racist revolutionary political prisoner, speaks of prison as, quote, a relationship with an abuser who controls your every move, keeps you locked in the house. There's the ever-present threat of violence or further repression if you don't toe the line, end quote. While Buck is specifically referring to her experience within a particular prison, the metaphor of an abusive relationship is significant when one considers the prison industrial complex as the abuser and marginalized communities as the survivor. The Network / La Red, a lesbian, bisexual, gay, transgender, and queer domestic violence organization based in Boston, Massachusetts, defines partner abuse as, quote, a systematic pattern of control where one person tries to control the thoughts, beliefs, and or actions of their partner, someone they are dating, or someone they had an intimate relationship with, end quote. The prison industrial complex is the ever-present force in the daily lives of those most marginalized in our society, continuously constricting the borders of what is considered right, legal, and appropriate, while constantly limiting access to loved ones and support structures. Throughout this essay, I will use the terms racism and white supremacy interchangeably. Racism is commonly understood now as a combination of institutional power and prejudice that creates systems to privilege white people at the expense of people of color. Ruth Wilson Gilmore defines racism in Golden Gulag, Prison Surplus, Crisis, and Opposition in Globalizing California as, quote, the state-sanctioned and or extra-legal production and exploitation of group-differentiated vulnerability to premature death. Prison expansion is a new iteration of this theme, end quote. White supremacy is one of the foundational building blocks of the U.S. prison system. In order to understand the complexity of the penal system in the United States, one must also understand the complexity of white supremacy. Andrea Smith offers a framework for understanding these deep complexities in the 3 pillars of white supremacy. This framework does not assume that racism and white supremacy are enacted in a singular fashion. Rather, white supremacy is constituted by separate and distinct, but still interrelated logics. Envision 3 pillars, one labeled slavery/capitalism, another labeled genocide/capitalism, and the last one labeled Orientalism/war, as well as arrows connecting each of the pillars together. The prison-industrial complex has the capacity to operate within each of these pillars of white supremacy, creating intra-racial struggles and perpetuating divisions. Queerness is challenging to fit into a box of definition. In some ways, that is one of its strengths. In other ways, it complicates the conversation. Other writers in this anthology will more aptly divulge a multitude of queer theories open to interpretation. For the purpose of this essay, I look at queerness as not only the identity of those violently targeted by the prison-industrial complex, but also as a sexual, political, and social tool for deconstructing the borders of power. Queerness is not only about fiercer sex, truer gender expression, and theoretical masturbation. It has the potential to expand the possibilities available to intersectional movements for liberation. Abolition of the prison-industrial complex is not some ridiculous pipe dream, but rather what queer theorist José Esteban Muñoz would call a concrete utopia. Muñoz suggests, quote, concrete utopias are the hopes of a collective, an emergent group, or even a solitary oddball who is the one who dreams for many. Concrete utopias are the realm of educated hope, end quote. Conceptions of abolition come out of communities most impacted by the prison-industrial complex, and are told through stories of survival in mediocre to amazing prisoner poetry within resistance chants outside of police stations, and through the actions of thieves, sex workers, saboteurs, and others considered criminal by the state. Abolition is not only the goal of eliminating all forms of state control, corporate profit for exploited labor, police surveillance, and destruction of prison walls, but also the strategy for getting us there. Abolition and anarchism hold the same strategies and goals of collective liberation and community autonomy. As Peggy Corniger writes, quote, to separate the process from the goals of revolution is to ensure the perpetuation of oppressive structure and style, end quote. As mainstream and assimilationist gay and lesbian organizations push for the passage of hate crimes legislation, such as the Matthew Shepard Act, they directly perpetuate the power of the prison-industrial complex by relying on its violence, while stating that they wish to protect our communities from hateful attacks and murder. Anarchists and abolitionists together have a responsibility to publicly oppose these types of legislation and must offer concrete alternatives that authentically strive to make our communities safer from interpersonal violence, as well as systemic violence. Mainstream gay and lesbian organizations have a tendency to exploit our sadness, pain, and suffering after losing people we love and care about to give rise to their campaigns for hate crimes legislation. Organizations such as the Sylvia Rivera Law Project, Communities United Against Violence, Audre Lorde Project, and multiple chapters of Incite, Women of Color Against Violence, have all actively supported survivors of violence while also opposing hate crimes legislation, work that must be understood as part of our anarchist and abolitionist struggle. The need to consistently challenge GLBT and queer groups' involvement in the prison-industrial complex is not new work for our movements. Kwasi Balagoon wrote on May 31st, 1983, quote, when a gay group protests lack of police protection by making an alliance with police to form a gay task force, they ain't making a stand against the system. They are joining it. End quote. Many police forces in major cities around the United States have gay and lesbian community liaison, and pride marches often have some kind of gay police force fraternity parading along with corporations next to drag queens and community organizations. These types of hypocrisy are exactly why anarchism and abolition are needed at queer celebrations and in queer movements. When it is operating at its best, anarchism is tearing down the borders of nation states, smashing the borders of capitalist control, and transgressing all borders of oppression and authoritarianism. When queerness is operating at its best, it is tearing down the borders of gender, smashing the confines of compulsory monogamy, and transgressing the moralism of sex and sexuality. When abolition is at its best, it is tearing down the prison walls, smashing the police state, and transgressing the power of punishment while instituting new forms of transformative justice. I recognize that all of this destruction and abolition can appear to be placed strictly in the negative and oppositional, without a positive vision for society. However, all of this border destruction and wall crumbling provides a beautiful opportunity for creativity and new visions that are already being articulated and acted upon throughout the world. Not only is abolition a concrete utopia, queerness and anarchism flourish in the growing space. And yet we understand that this concrete utopia has not yet arrived. In Sight, Women of Color Against Violence and Critical Resistance wrote a much-needed critique and demand of the abolitionist movement. Do not pretend we have already reached some utopian community alternative that is actually supporting survivors of violence, and be sure to actually create and facilitate alternatives to the prison industrial complex that keep people safe and accountable for the suffering and trauma that exists and is perpetuated on the left and throughout the entirety of our culture. I think it is when queerness, abolition, and anarchism are in relationship with each other that we have the greatest creative power to actually create a project and culture that celebrates the possibilities of our humanness. How do we move forward? It takes more than articles, hand-holding, or hand jobs to build these relationships and to create effective strategies for winning. When strategizing to abolish the prison industrial complex, many more voices are needed at the table. Transgender women of color, working class faggots, and anarchist dykes, who are all directly targeted by police surveillance and criminalization of their lives, need to be prioritized as experts on the violence of the prison industrial complex. The policing of public sex must get on the agenda of abolitionists. The pervasiveness of sexual violence in prison and the particular targeting of queer and transgender people need to be addressed with community programs and group therapy or processing opportunities in anarchist spaces. Many anarchists need to reconsider their repulsion of identity politics and learn some of their history. Alexander Berkman's Prison Memoirs of an Anarchist was, quote, one of the most important political texts dealing with homosexuality to have been written by an American before the 1950s. End quote. However, while reading Berkman, anarchists should be critical of his gay sex negativity and fear, and question how his own internalized homophobia impacted his understanding of his own same-gender sexual desires. Queer organizations need to be more vocal in opposition to hate crimes legislation and look at models of community accountability programs and see what can meet the needs of their organizing efforts. These same groups should also host self-defense classes. In Boston, Queers with Guns takes a group of queers to a shooting range to learn how to shoot handguns, revolvers, and assault weapons. There need to be more groups that are actually protecting queer and transgender people. The Audre Lorde Project has developed the Safe Outside the System project that works to address community issues without relying on the police. These projects must not be isolated, and they need to communicate with other queer organizations to foster growth and development of even more programs like these in many other communities and cities. Strategizing must be both long-term and short-term. Any good strategy is shaped by history. Stories must be told and articles must be read about the out-of-control lesbian committee to support women political prisoners, which was founded in 1986 for the purpose of resisting the Lexington Control Unit for women in Kentucky. Stories must be told about the Pink Panthers, who established themselves in multiple cities around the United States to defend queer and transgender people who were on the streets, living, or walking home. Queers need to learn about Men Against Sexism in Walla Walla Prison, the George Jackson Brigade, and other 1960s and 1970s revolutionary queer movements and campaigns. As Mumia Abu-Jamal continues to be locked behind the walls, we need to remember the roles queers have played in his support campaigns, especially rainbow flags for Mumia. The actions of ACT UP, including their creative political confrontations and advocacy for compassionate release for prisoners living with HIV/AIDS, must be shared while picking each other up on the dance floor. We need to hear these stories and tell these stories to our lovers, friends, and anyone who will be our comrades in our growing movements. We need to listen for the explicit anarchist aspects and the implicit anarchist forms of organizing. In our experience of inspiration, we have the potential to continue living in the hope for our struggles to succeed. When we tell our history, it is given new life, as it breathes new life into us. Support for queer and transgender people who are in prison or being attacked by other arms of the prison industrial complex is not only something of the past. In Montreal, the Prisoner Correspondence Project connects queer and transgender prisoners with free world people for pen pal friendships, and their website acts as an extensive resource for free world pen pals. The Transgender, Gender Variant, and Intersex Justice Project in San Francisco, headed up by Miss Major, works to support transgender, gender variant, and intersex people who are incarcerated in California prisons and beyond. TGIJP also works with people as they get out of prison and is run by formerly incarcerated transgender women, specifically transgender women of color. They were among a large coordinating effort that brought together Transforming Justice, a conference and ongoing national project that works to bring attention to the impact the prison industrial complex has on transgender people, particularly transgender people of color and low-income and poor transgender people. Chicago has the Right to Win Collective, which is a pen pal project for transgender, transsexual, queer, gender self-determining, and gender variant people who are living and surviving inside Illinois prisons. In Boston, I am part of the outside leadership circle of Black and Pink. There is also a leadership circle of currently incarcerated people. We produce a monthly newsletter of queer and transgender prisoner written stories, political articles, and poetry that we send to approximately 1,300 queer and transgender prisoners. We also maintain a list of incarcerated people looking for pen pals that is available on the Black and Pink website. As we continue to grow, we are able to do more direct support for prisoners, community outreach, and trainings about the impact of the prison industrial complex on queer communities. Our statement of purpose describes our work. Quote, Black and Pink is an open family of LGBTQ prisoners and free world allies who support each other. Our work toward the abolition of the prison industrial complex is rooted in the experience of currently and formerly incarcerated people. We are outraged by the specific violence of the prison industrial complex against LGBTQ people and respond through advocacy, education, direct service, and organizing. End quote. We choose to call ourselves a family after all the letters we received writing to us as their Black and Pink family. So often, the families queer and trans people come from can be so harmful and we have the potential to help queer the notion of family and provide real care and attention too often denied. Black and Pink and all of these other projects have anarchist leanings, if they are not explicitly anarchist. They are all abolitionist projects and strive to be accountable to those most impacted by the violence of the prison industrial complex. New history of queer involvement in abolition and anarchism is being created daily. More projects and new strategies are always needed. Cop Watch is a strategy used in multiple cities that has a strong anarchist analysis and abolitionist approach. There are multiple Cop Watch groups around the United States. Chicago, Portland, the Bay Area, and New York City have the strongest and most successful Cop Watch organizations. Massachusetts has a functional Cop Watch in Western Massachusetts and a sporadic chapter in Boston. The Portland Cop Watch lists their goals as, quote, to empower victims of police misconduct to pursue their grievances, with a goal of resolving individual cases and preventing future occurrences, to educate the general public, and in particular, target groups of police abuse on their rights and responsibilities, and to promote and monitor an effective system of civilian oversight of police, end quote. Cop Watches regularly patrol the streets and monitor police activity with video cameras and still photo cameras as a form of deterrence of police brutality, and to document any misconduct that does occur. Cop Watch is completely legal and can provide a vital organizing tool in communities most impacted by policing. During the New York City Gay Pride March, a coalition of queer people of color organizations formed a Cop Watch patrol because of the long history of police targeting queers of color during the parade, and the lack of support by parade organizers and mainstream gay and lesbian organizations. The Boston Cop Watch did outreach in the Fens, a highly policed public sex spot. Queers and queer analyses are needed within Cop Watch groups to best serve the needs of highly policed queer and transgender people. Another strategy for organizing is called the attrition model, the rubbing away or wearing down by friction, the persistent and continuing strategy necessary to diminish the function and power of prisons in our society. This strategy specifically targets the prison and incarceration aspects of the prison industrial complex. It begins with moratorium on all prison, jail, detention center growth, development, research, and building. The moratorium process forces the government and corporations to examine alternatives to incarcerating people. Moratoriums have a measurable impact in prohibiting the future development of the physical confinement institutions of the prison industrial complex. While we fight for a moratorium on all expansion in the punishment industry, the next step in the strategy is decarceration. Decarceration is a struggle to get as many people as possible out of prison. While the strategy of a neo-underground railroad should certainly be attempted and advocated for, the repercussions of those caught will certainly be severe. Other strategies include a prisoner release timeline, at least 80% immediately, 50% gradually, and the remaining 5% within 10 years. To accomplish that, first, 80% of all prisoners convicted of nonviolent offenses should be released. Next, we should ensure the compassionate release of all prisoners with terminal diseases, all prisoners over the age of 65, all prisoners convicted of sex work, all prisoners convicted of killing or injuring their abusive partners, and all prisoners who have served 10 years or more on a sentence. Certainly, all of these individuals getting out of prison will need support structures to acclimate into society. Programs to serve formerly incarcerated people will need to be individualized. In 2006, $68 billion was spent on corrections. Quote, the average annual operating cost per state inmate in 2001 was $22,650, or $62 per day. Among facilities operated by the Federal Bureau of Prisons, it was $22,000 per inmate, or $62 per day. End quote. If the United States is able to spend that amount on incarcerating people every year, then it should be able to spend half that amount to care for people in their process of returning to society with money that should be given directly to community-based organizations, not state-controlled programs. The next step in the struggle for abolition is excarceration, the act of not putting people in prison. This is where the transformative justice practices come in. Decriminalization must also be included in this process. In the United States, 1 in 31 adults are either on probation, parole, or incarcerated. Tactics to excarcerate include, quote, abolish categories of crime, start by decriminalizing crimes without victims, abolish bail and pre-trial detention, let people out, create community dispute and mediation centers, utilize suspended sentences, fines, and restitution, establish community probation, and create legislative standards and procedures for alternative sentencing. End quote. These are by no means exhaustive lists of possibilities, but rather a spotlight on particular strategies as suggested by abolitionists. At all levels, there is a need for a queer and anarchist analysis in order to keep the goal, our concrete utopia, at the forefront of the organizing. It is far too easy for liberals to co-opt abolitionist campaigns. Queer anarchists have a vital role to play in holding everyone accountable to the larger vision. As we tear down the walls of the prison industrial complex, let us continue to build and create revolutionary communities at the same time. These communities will be anarcho-queer spaces that affirm the great potentiality of our humanness. We must live the alternatives, even as we work to deconstruct the systems that we are forced to operate within. As we are queering anarchism and queering the abolitionist movement, we will find ourselves in spaces where we have to address the problem of sexual violence within our communities. We will have to address concerns about the continued forms of oppression that we perpetuate. With attentiveness to our complexities as human beings, we will be able to truly engage one another in movement building as we bring together the intersections of movements and tactics that too often exist within their own spaces. The walls and borders we must tear down are not only those belonging to the state or to capitalism, but also those that keep our movements from working together and informing one another. Our potential is in our capacity to fight oppression on all of its fronts, and these queer anarchist abolitionist tools are going to be needed if we intend to win.